The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Detective James Hargrove's office as he sipped his black coffee, reviewing case files spread across his desk. The steam from his cup fogged up the bottom of his reading glasses. He'd been doing this same routine for almost 20 years now. At 53, his once dark hair had given way to salt and pepper, with more salt these days. The officers at the Riverview Police Department often joked that you could set your watch by Hargrove's morning routine. Morning Detective called Officer Liz Parker as she walked by his open door. Hargrove raised his mug in greeting without looking up from his papers. Everyone in the department respected him. They had good reason to. Over his career, he'd solved more cases than any other detective in the department's history. His wall was covered with commendations, and a local paper had written features about him 3 times. The community trusted him. Kids would wave at his police cruiser when he drove through neighborhoods. "Got those files you asked for," said Tom Wilson, a young rookie who looked up to Hargrove like he was some kind of legend. Tom placed a thick folder on the edge of the desk. "The Henderson robbery and that car theft ring from the east side." "Thanks, kid," Hargrove said, finally looking up. His eyes were tired but still sharp. Years of police work had given him a gaze that seemed to cut right through people. Criminals often confessed just sitting across from him in the interrogation room. "How's the training going?" "Good, sir. Learning a lot," Tom replied, lingering by the door. "My wife's making her famous lasagna tonight. We'd love to have you over." Hargrove smiled. "Another time, matey. Got plans with the grandkids this weekend." After Tom left, Hargrove opened his desk drawer and glanced at the framed photo of his daughter's family. 2 little ones, ages 5 and 7, with gap-toothed smiles. He'd been thinking more and more about retirement lately. Fishing trips, school pickups, maybe even that road trip down the coast he and his late wife had always talked about. His phone rang, breaking his thoughts. "Hargrove," he answered, his voice gruff from years of early mornings and late nights. "Detective, it's Chief Barnes. Need you to stop by my office when you get a chance." "Be right there," Hargrove replied, standing up and straightening his tie. The chief's office was at the end of the hallway, a corner room with windows overlooking Main Street. Chief Richard Barnes was 15 years younger than Hargrove, but had risen through the ranks quickly. Smart guy, good leader, though some officers thought he cared too much about politics and public image. "Take a seat, Jim," Barnes said, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. "Coffee?" "Already had 3 cups, but thanks." Barnes nodded. "I'll cut to the chase. The mayor's office called about Walter Kensington. Seems he's been making noise about the River Heights development project." Hargrove raised an eyebrow. Everyone in Riverview knew Walter Kensington. The 78-year-old real estate mogul lived in that massive stone mansion overlooking the harbor. Worth millions. Showed up in the society pages donating to charities, but otherwise kept to himself since his wife died years back. "What kind of noise?" Hargrove asked. "He's claiming there are irregularities in the project approvals. Threatening to hire private investigators, go to the state authorities." Barnes leaned forward. "The mayor thinks he's just a bored old man looking for attention, but we need to handle this carefully. Kensington has friends in high places." "And what do you want me to do about it?" Hargrove asked, though he already knew the answer. "Talk to him. You've got that way with people. See what he's really after. Maybe he just wants to feel important. Make him feel heard, then guide him away from stirring up trouble. The River Heights project means thousands of jobs for Riverview." Hargrove nodded slowly. "I'll see what I can do." Back in his office, Hargrove researched Walter Kensington while finishing his now-cold coffee. The man had built his fortune from nearly nothing, starting with a small inheritance and turning it into a real estate empire. He'd developed half the waterfront properties in Riverview during the 1980s boom. His wife Catherine had been a force in local politics until her death from cancer 8 years ago. They had one son, Peter, who reportedly had little contact with his father these days. The police database showed nothing on Kensington except for a speeding ticket from 12 years ago and a break-in at his home that turned out to be a false alarm. No criminal record. Not even a parking violation. Later that afternoon, Hargrove drove his unmarked police car up the winding road to Kensington Estate. Tall iron gates opened after he showed his badge to the security camera. The driveway was long, lined with perfectly trimmed hedges that probably cost more to maintain than Hargrove's yearly salary. A housekeeper answered the door, an older woman with a kind face and cautious eyes. "Mr. Kensington is in his study," she said, leading Hargrove through the marble entryway. The inside of the mansion was surprisingly modest given the owner's wealth. Tasteful artwork, comfortable-looking furniture, family photos on side tables, not the flashy display Hargrove had expected. Walter Kensington sat behind a large wooden desk, looking out the window toward the harbor. He turned when Hargrove entered. Despite his age, Kensington looked fit, with a full head of white hair and alert blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a casual sweater rather than the suit Hargrove had imagined. "Detective Hargrove," Kensington said, standing to shake hands. His grip was firm. "I've been expecting someone from the city to show up. Though I thought they'd send a lawyer, not a policeman." "Just a friendly visit, Mr. Kensington," Hargrove said, taking the offered seat across from the desk. "The mayor mentioned you had some concerns about the River Heights project." Kensington's expression hardened slightly. "Concerns? Yes, you could say that. Would you like some tea, detective? Or perhaps something stronger?" "Tea would be fine, thank you." Kensington pressed a button on his desk, and minutes later the housekeeper returned with a silver tray holding an elegant teapot and 2 cups. "My late wife's favorite blend," Kensington said as he poured. "Imported from England. She always said proper tea required proper ceremony." Hargrove accepted the cup, surprised by the old man's hospitality. This wasn't going like he'd expected. Usually when the department sent him to smooth things over, people were either intimidated or hostile. "So," Hargrove began after taking a sip, "these irregularities you mentioned." "Not irregularities, detective. Corruption." Kensington's voice remained calm, but his eyes flashed. "I've been in real estate development for over 50 years. I know how the numbers are supposed to add up. The River Heights contracts are inflated by millions, and the money is disappearing into shell companies." Hargrove kept his face neutral. "That's a serious accusation." "It is, and I can prove it." Kensington stood and walked to a wall safe hidden behind a painting. "I may be old, Detective Hargrove, but I'm not senile, and I'm not looking for attention. What I am looking for is answers." He returned with a thick folder. "This contains everything I've found so far. Bank records, shell company registrations, patterns of suspicious payments. I was going to take it to the FBI next week, but since you're here." Hargrove's pulse quickened as he accepted the folder. Opening it, he saw pages of financial records, property documents, and what looked like bank statements. This was considerably more than the ramblings of a bored old man. "I respect your career, detective," Kensington continued. "People in town speak highly of you. That's why I'm sharing this with you first, before going outside local channels." As Hargrove flipped through the documents, one name jumped out at him. A name that shouldn't have been there. A name that changed everything. His own. Walter Kensington loved mornings. Even at 78, he woke before sunrise, a habit from his younger days when he'd arrive at construction sites before his workers. He sat on his balcony overlooking Riverview Harbor, watching fishing boats head out to sea as the sky turned from gray to pink to blue. His housekeeper, Mrs. Alvarez, brought him coffee and toast with blackberry jam at exactly 6:30 a.m. The gardener asked about the rosebushes, Mr. Kensington, she said, arranging his breakfast on the small table beside his chair. She'd worked for him for 23 years, since before his wife got sick. "Tell him to replace the ones by the east fence," Walter replied. "Catherine always said roses need to be refreshed every decade." Mrs. Alvarez nodded. They both mentioned Catherine often, keeping her memory alive in the house she'd loved. The mansion felt too big now, with just Walter and the staff. 5 bedrooms, a library, formal dining room, spaces designed for entertaining political figures and business partners, for family holidays and grandchildren who never arrived. After breakfast, Walter dressed in his usual outfit, pressed gray slacks, a light blue button-down shirt, and a sweater vest. No need for the suits and ties he'd worn during his business career. His closet still held dozens, perfectly maintained. Sometimes he'd open Catherine's closet too, just to catch the fading scent of her perfume on her clothes. Walter's morning routine included a walk through the gardens, a review of his investments, and calls with his lawyer, Harold Green. Today, Harold arrived in person, carrying a briefcase and looking worried. "You're making powerful enemies, Walt," Harold said as they sat in the study. They'd been friends since college, and Harold was one of the few people who still called him Walt. "The mayor called me yesterday. Wanted to know if I could talk some sense into you." Walter chuckled. "And what did you tell him?" "That you're the most stubborn man in Riverview." Harold adjusted his glasses. "But seriously, these allegations about the River Heights project, are you sure about this? The documents you showed me, if you're right, half the city council could go to jail." "I'm sure." Walter turned his computer screen to show Harold a spreadsheet. "Look at these numbers. Construction costs inflated by 30%. Materials that were never delivered. Consultants being paid triple market rates. And the money all leads back to the same 3 shell companies." Harold whistled low. "And you think Detective Hargrove is involved?" "His name is on several of the documents. Monthly payments of $5,000 from Blue Water Consulting, which doesn't seem to consult on anything except making money disappear." Walter leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking every year of his age. "I respected that man. Everyone does. That's what makes this so disappointing." "What are you going to do?" Walter sighed. "What I've always done. The right thing." He looked at the wall of photographs. Catherine cutting ribbons at charity events, Walter breaking ground on affordable housing projects, their son Peter graduating college. "I built this town, Harold. My buildings, my investments. I won't let them turn it into a corruption playground." After Harold left, Walter drove himself into town in his old Mercedes. He could have hired a driver years ago, but he enjoyed the independence. He parked near the public library and made his way to a small coffee shop across the street. The young barista, Jenny, smiled when she saw him. The usual Mr. K. "Please, Jenny." He sat at his regular corner table, watching people pass by on the sidewalk. Many nodded to him or waved. In a town like Riverview, everyone knew Walter Kensington. A young man approached his table hesitantly. "Mr. Kensington, sorry to bother you. I'm Paul Turner from the Riverview Gazette." He looked fresh out of college, with an eager expression and a notebook in hand. Walter gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Have a seat, Mr. Turner." "I'm doing a feature on the River Heights development," Paul explained, setting a recorder on the table. "I was hoping to get your perspective, since you developed that area originally." Walter studied the young reporter. "Who suggested you talk to me?" Paul looked surprised. "My editor. Said you might have interesting insights since you've been critical of the project." "And what have you found out so far about River Heights?" Paul flipped through his notebook. "The usual PI stuff. 500 new jobs, revitalization of the waterfront, green building practices. The mayor's office is pushing it hard." "And the budget? The contractors? Have you looked into those?" "That's not really my angle. It's more about the community impact." Paul's expression changed, noting Walter's intensity. "Is there something I should be looking into?" Walter considered his next move carefully. The boy seemed genuine, but inexperienced. "Let me ask you something, Mr. Turner. Are you interested in writing puff pieces for the rest of your career, or do you want to be a real journalist?" Paul sat up straighter. "A real journalist, sir." Walter nodded, pulled out a business card, and wrote something on the back. "Come to this address tomorrow at 4 p.m. Bring your editor if you can. I have information that might change your story completely." Later that afternoon, Walter visited his wife's grave in the hillside cemetery overlooking the town. He brought fresh flowers, as he did every week. "Things are getting complicated, Kat," he said, arranging the lilies in the built-in vase of the headstone. "Remember when I wanted to retire after the Harbor Point project? You told me, Walter Kensington, you still have work to do in this town." He smiled at the memory of her determination. "Well, I think this might be my last project, the most important one." On his drive home, Walter noticed a police cruiser in his rearview mirror. It followed him for several blocks before turning off. Probably nothing, he thought, but he found himself checking the mirrors more frequently the rest of the way home. That evening, Walter received an unexpected phone call. When he answered, the voice was familiar but unwelcome. "Mr. Kensington, it's Mayor Frank Collins. We need to talk." I believe we have nothing to discuss, Frank, Walter replied coolly. I think we do. Detective Hargrove mentioned your concerns. Look, you're an important man in this community. We'd value your input. Maybe we could meet, discuss how to address your issues with the project. My issues aren't with the project, Frank. They're with the corruption behind it. A pause on the line. Strong words, Walter. Very strong words. The truth often is. Walter gazed out his study window at the darkening harbor. Lights from boats twinkled on the water. I'm meeting with the Gazette tomorrow. And after that, the state attorney's office. The mayor's voice hardened. You should reconsider that, for your own good. Is that a threat, Frank? A friendly warning. You're not a young man anymore. Stress isn't good for your health. After hanging up, Walter sat in silence for a long time. Then he went to his safe, removed a thick folder of documents, and began making copies. One set went into a sealed envelope marked, "In case of emergency," with Harold's name on it. Walter knew he might be making the most dangerous move of his life, but some things were worth the risk. Fog rolled in from the harbor, thick and ghostly under the streetlights of Blackwater Bridge. Detective Hargrove's police cruiser moved slowly through the mist, wipers beating a steady rhythm against the light drizzle that had started 30 minutes earlier. The dashboard clock read 10:17 p.m. In the passenger seat, Walter Kensington sat stiffly, his hands folded over the leather briefcase in his lap. He hadn't spoken since they'd left his estate. Weather's getting worse, Hargrove commented, breaking the silence. April in Riverview. Never know what you're gonna get. Walter stared straight ahead. Where exactly are we going, detective? Thought we could talk somewhere private. This case you're building, it's complicated. It's not complicated at all, Walter replied, his voice steady despite his growing unease. It's quite simple. Money is being stolen. People are being bribed, and you're one of them. Hargrove's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. Like I said, complicated. The cruiser slowed as they reached the middle of the bridge. Below them, the river churned dark and powerful. The city lights reflected on the water looked distorted through the fog, like melting stars. Why did you stop? Walter asked, his heart beginning to race. Need to check something, Hargrove said, putting the car in park and turning on his hazard lights. Stay here. Walter watched as Hargrove got out and walked around to the front of the car, seemingly examining something in the headlights. The detective's behavior had been strange from the moment he'd shown up unannounced at Walter's door an hour earlier. Need to talk, Hargrove had said on the doorstep, looking nervously over his shoulder. Not here. Too many ears. Walter had agreed to go with him, but not before slipping Harold's envelope into the secret compartment of his desk drawer. A precaution, just in case. Now, watching Hargrove through the foggy windshield, Walter wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. He reached for his cell phone. The driver's door yanked open. Problem with the car, Hargrove said, sliding back into his seat. But he didn't restart the engine. Instead, he turned to face Walter directly. I saw the documents, Mr. Kensington. The ones with my name. I need to know who else has seen them. Walter's fingers closed around his phone in his pocket. My lawyer. The reporter from the Gazette. And tomorrow, the state attorney's office. Hargrove nodded slowly. I thought so. He looked tired suddenly, older than his 53 years. You don't understand what you're dealing with, Mr. Kensington. These people, they don't play by the rules. And you do? Taking bribes to look the other way? A flash of anger crossed the detective's face. You think it's that simple? That black and white? I didn't have a choice. We always have choices, Detective Hargrove. Easy for you to say. You've got millions. A big house on the hill. What about the rest of us? My daughter's husband lost his job. Medical bills piling up for my grandkids. The department cutting pensions. Hargrove's voice had risen. Then they come to me with an offer. Just ignore a few things. Look the other way sometimes. Nobody gets hurt. People do get hurt, Walter said firmly. The taxpayers. The community. The law. Hargrove laughed bitterly. The law. You rich folks always hide behind that when it's convenient. He took a deep breath. Get out of the car, Mr. Kensington. I beg your pardon? Out. Now, we're going to finish this conversation in the fresh air. Fear crept up Walter's spine, but he kept his expression neutral as he stepped out into the misty night. The wind had picked up, whipping across the bridge. Few cars passed at this hour. They were alone with the sound of rushing water below. Hargrove led him to the pedestrian walkway on the edge of the bridge. "You need to drop this investigation," the detective said, looking out over the dark water. "Tell your lawyer it was a mistake. Tell that reporter kid you got confused." Walter shook his head. "I can't do that. You have to, for your own good." There was something desperate in Hargrove's voice now. "They sent me to warn you, but that's not all. If you don't back down, the next person they send won't be giving warnings." "Are you threatening me, detective?" "I'm trying to save your life," Hargrove hissed. "These people don't care about your reputation or your good name in this town. To them, you're just a problem to solve." Walter stood straight, despite the cold wind making his old bones ache. "I've faced worse than corrupt officials and dirty cops in my time." Something changed in Hargrove's eyes then, a hardening. A decision made. "I'm sorry it's come to this," he said quietly. Walter saw the movement too late, Hargrove's hands shoving against his chest. He stumbled backward, briefcase falling, arms windmilling as he tried to catch his balance. His back hit the railing. For one suspended moment, Walter looked into Hargrove's eyes and saw regret mixed with determination. Then he was falling, the bridge lights spiraling away above him. The water hit like concrete. Cold shocked Walter's system as the current immediately began to pull him under. He fought against it, arms thrashing, lungs burning. At 78, he was still a strong swimmer. Catherine had insisted they do laps at the community pool well into their 70s, but the river was powerful and the shock of impact had knocked the wind from him. Just when his strength began to fail, his hand struck something solid, one of the bridge support pillars. Walter clung to it, pulling himself partly out of the water. The roar of the river nearly drowned out the sound of a car engine starting above. Hargrove was leaving, believing his job complete. Walter tried to call for help, but his voice was lost in the wind and water. The current tugged at his legs, threatening to tear him away from his precarious handhold. The concrete was rough against his palms, cutting into his skin, but he held on. He wouldn't die here. Not like this. Not before exposing the truth. Somewhere nearby, Walter heard a strange mechanical whirring sound. A light cut through the darkness, illuminating the water around him. For a moment, he thought rescue had arrived impossibly fast. But it wasn't the police or fire department. The light came from underwater, rising slowly to the surface about 10 feet away. As Walter watched in disbelief, a dark shape emerged from the river, some kind of small submersible device with lights and what looked like camera equipment. Behind it, a head broke the surface. A woman in a wetsuit, wearing what appeared to be specialized gear. She spotted Walter clinging to the pillar and her eyes widened in shock. For a long moment, they stared at each other, the elderly millionaire fighting for his life and the mysterious woman who had apparently been beneath the bridge all along. Then she made a decision. Swimming powerfully against the current, she made her way to him. "Hold on," she shouted over the rush of water. "I've got you." As she reached for him, Walter's grip finally gave way. The river claimed him, pulling him under into darkness. The last thing he felt was the woman's hand closing around his wrist, fighting to keep him from disappearing into the depths. 3 days after Walter Kensington's funeral, Detective Hargrove sat at his desk staring at the framed commendation on his wall. The glass was smudged. Had it always been that way? The precinct bustled around him, phones ringing, officers talking, life continuing as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The official report listed Walter's death as a suicide. Elderly millionaire, recently showing signs of mental decline, jumps from Blackwater Bridge. That's what the papers printed. That's what the chief told the press. That's what Hargrove had written in his statement. He took another sip of cold coffee and winced at the bitterness. Sleep had become a distant memory. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Walter's face as he fell. "Detective." Officer Tom Wilson stood in his doorway. "Captain wants to see you." Hargrove nodded, straightening his tie. The walk to Captain Miller's office felt longer than usual. Officers nodded as he passed. Some even smiled. If they only knew. Captain Miller was a square-jawed woman in her late 40s who ran the precinct with military precision. She motioned for Hargrove to close the door. "We've got a problem, Jim," she said without preamble. "Internal Affairs is asking questions about the Kensington case." Hargrove kept his face neutral. "What kind of questions?" "Timeline discrepancies. You said you dropped Kensington at his estate gates at 10:45 p.m., but the security footage from his house shows no police cruiser that night." A cold knot formed in Hargrove's stomach. He'd forgotten about Kensington's home security system. A rookie mistake. Must be a glitch in their system. I definitely dropped him off. Miller studied him. They'd worked together for 15 years. "There's more." Kensington's lawyer came forward with some documents. Sealed envelope labeled "in case of untimely death." The room seemed to tilt slightly. What kind of documents? Records. Financial stuff. Allegations about the River Heights development project. She paused. "Your name is in there, Jim." Hargrove's mouth went dry. "My name?" "Monthly payments from shell companies. Dates, amounts, account numbers." She leaned forward. "Tell me it's not true." The silence stretched between them. 20 years of partnership and respect hung in the balance. "It's complicated," he finally said. Captain Miller's face hardened. "Damn it, Jim." Of all people, she stood up and turned to look out her window. "I wants to interview you tomorrow morning. This is now officially a homicide investigation." "Lisa, I don't." She raised her hand without turning around. "I'm not your friend right now. I'm your superior officer. Badge and gun on my desk. You're on administrative leave, effective immediately." At the Riverview Gazette office, Paul Turner stayed at his computer screen, the cursor blinking at the end of his half-written article. The editor-in-chief, Bill Hansen, looked over his shoulder. "Still nothing solid?" Hansen asked. Paul shook his head. "Just what we already know. Kensington dies. Detective claims he dropped him at home after giving him a ride, but the timeline doesn't add up." "Not enough for a story," Hansen sighed. "Without proof, we'd be asking for a lawsuit." "I was supposed to meet with him," Paul said quietly, "the day after he died. He said he had information that would change everything about the River Heights story. And now we'll never know what it was." Hansen squeezed his shoulder. "That's journalism, kid. Sometimes the story dies with the source." After Hansen walked away, Paul pulled out Walter Kensington's business card with the meeting details scribbled on the back. Something about this didn't add up. A respected businessman with no history of mental illness suddenly jumps off a bridge. After hinting at corruption. After arranging to share evidence with a reporter. Paul grabbed his jacket. Taking an early lunch, he called to no one in particular. 20 minutes later, he parked outside the tall iron gates of Kensington Estate. The intercom buzzed when he pressed the button. "Yes," a woman's voice, heavily accented. "Paul Turner from the Riverview Gazette. I had a meeting scheduled with Mr. Kensington before his passing. I was wondering if I could speak with anyone who might know what he wanted to share with me." A long pause. Then, "Come in." The housekeeper, Mrs. Alvarez, met him at the door. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but her spine was straight and proud. "Mr. Kensington spoke of you," she said, leading him through the impressive entryway. The young reporter asking the right questions. In the study, a gray-haired man in an expensive suit was sorting through papers at Walter's desk. "Mr. Turner," he extended his hand. "Harold Green. I was Walter's attorney and friend for 40 years. They spoke for almost an hour. About Walter's concerns regarding the River Heights project. About the financial irregularities he discovered. About his meeting with Detective Hargrove just before his death. He didn't kill himself, Mrs. Alvarez said firmly from the doorway where she'd been listening. Mr. Kensington was not that kind of man." Harold nodded in agreement. "Walter left this with me." He slid a thick envelope across the desk. Copies of everything he found. Names, dates, amounts. He was going to the authorities the day after he met with you. Paul's hands trembled as he opened it. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because the police might be compromised," Harold said grimly. "Walter trusted you to do the right thing with this information." At the Riverview Police Department, Lieutenant Grace Chen from Internal Affairs was having a very confusing day. The security footage from Walter Kensington's estate definitely showed no police cruiser on the night in question. The timeline in Detective Hargrove's report was impossible. But there was something else bothering her. She rewound the bridge surveillance footage again. The camera coverage was spotty due to the fog, but there was Hargrove's cruiser stopping mid-bridge at 10:42 p.m. Two figures exiting the vehicle. Then nothing visible for several minutes due to the fog. Then one figure returning to the car alone. What happened in those missing minutes? She muttered to herself. Her phone rang. The medical examiner's office. Lieutenant Chen, about the Kensington autopsy. We found something odd. The bruising pattern on the chest is inconsistent with a suicide jump. It suggests he was pushed with considerable force. Chen thanked him and hung up, mind racing. She pulled up Hargrove's personnel file on her computer. 20 years with the department, dozens of commendations, impeccable record. Until now. She was about to close the file when something caught her eye. A small notation in his financial records from 3 years ago, a sudden influx of money explained as family inheritance. Right around the time the River Heights project was approved, Chen picked up her phone again. Captain Miller? I think we need to bring Detective Hargrove in for formal questioning. Today. She hung up and stared at the frozen surveillance image on her screen. The fog swirling around the lonely bridge. One figure climbing into a car. Another nowhere to be seen. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that somewhere across town, a marine biologist named Eliza Chen, no relation, was sitting in her apartment, staring at footage from her underwater research cameras. Footage that showed things no one was ever supposed to see. Footage that would change everything. Eliza Chen's apartment was small but practical, with large windows that faced the harbor. Scientific journals and research papers were stacked on every available surface. A massive fish tank hummed in one corner, home to several species native to the Riverview waters that she studied. But Eliza wasn't looking at her fish tonight. She was staring at her laptop screen, watching the same video clip for what must have been the 100th time. Her hands shook slightly as she pressed play again. The underwater camera footage was remarkably clear despite the nighttime conditions, thanks to the specialized equipment she'd been using for her research. The timestamp read 10:43 p.m. The camera had been mounted on a small remote-controlled submersible that she'd been operating from beneath Blackwater Bridge. She'd been documenting the effects of artificial light on nocturnal river ecosystems, a project she'd been working on for months. The university grant money had finally allowed her to purchase the high-resolution equipment she needed. What she'd captured instead was something far more disturbing than light pollution. The footage showed the underside of the bridge, the massive concrete supports disappearing into the dark water. Then came the splash, a large object hitting the water. As the camera tilted upward, following the bubbles, she could clearly see an elderly man struggling in the current. And above him, visible for just a moment at the bridge railing, the silhouette of another figure watching him fall. Eliza paused the video and rubbed her eyes. She'd been there that night, in her small boat anchored beneath the bridge where most people wouldn't notice. She'd been controlling the submersible when she heard voices above, then a shout, then the splash. She'd immediately surfaced the submersible to see what had happened. She remembered the shock of seeing the old man fighting against the current, clinging desperately to a bridge support. She'd tried to help him, had actually reached him, grabbed his wrist, but the current had been too strong. He'd slipped away into the darkness before she could secure him. By the time rescue boats arrived, responding to a 911 call that reported a jumper, it was too late. They found his body half a mile downstream. The news the next day identified him as Walter Kensington, the Millionaire developer. They called it a suicide. But Eliza knew better. She'd seen the other figure on the bridge. And worse, when she reviewed her footage later, she realized the camera had captured a clear shot of the old man's face just before he went under. His eyes were wide with fear and determination, not the eyes of someone who wanted to die. For a week, she'd wrestled with what to do. Going to the police seemed logical, but what if the person who'd pushed Kensington was connected to law enforcement? The figure on the bridge had been too far away to identify clearly, but something about the silhouette suggested a uniform. Her phone rang, making her jump. Her colleague from the university, Dr. David Wong. "Have you seen the news?" he asked without preamble. "No, I've been working on something." She minimized the video window. "They're investigating that millionaire's death as a possible homicide now. Internal Affairs is looking into a detective who was supposedly with him that night. Eliza's heart raced. Did they name the detective? Hargrove, I think. James Hargrove. The article mentioned inconsistencies in his story. After hanging up, Eliza quickly searched for news articles about the investigation. There was Detective Hargrove's photo, a serious-looking man with salt and pepper hair. The shape and build matched the silhouette on her video. "Oh God," she whispered. She paced her small apartment, mind racing. She had evidence that could potentially solve a murder. But coming forward meant putting herself at risk. What if Hargrove wasn't acting alone? What if others in the department were involved? Her gaze fell on her research notes, a project she'd poured her heart into for years. The importance of Blackwater River's ecosystem, the effects of human activity on underwater life, her belief that scientific knowledge should serve the greater good. What about human life? Didn't that deserve the same protection? She thought of Walter Kensington's eyes in that last moment, desperate but determined. Then she thought of her father, who'd taught her that courage wasn't about being fearless, but about doing the right thing despite your fear. Decision made, Eliza downloaded the video to a secure drive and grabbed her keys. District Attorney Robert Palmer was working late, buried in case files, when his assistant buzzed him. "There's a Dr. Chen here to see you, says it's urgent regarding the Kensington case." Palmer sighed. Another crackpot with a conspiracy theory, probably. The Kensington case was high-profile enough to attract all kinds. Send her in. The woman who entered his office didn't look like a crackpot. Young, professional, clearly nervous but composed. She placed a laptop on his desk. "I have evidence regarding Walter Kensington's death," she said without introduction. It wasn't a suicide. Palmer had heard this claim a dozen times in the past week. "And you know this how, Dr. Chen?" "I was there. Under the bridge, conducting research. My underwater cameras captured everything." Now he was paying attention. Everything. Mr. Kensington being pushed, his struggle in the water, and Detective Hargrove watching from above. Palmer's wariness vanished. "Show me." As the video played, Palmer's expression grew increasingly grave. The footage was remarkably clear. There was no doubt about what it showed. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" he asked when it ended. Eliza looked down. "I was afraid. I tried to save him that night, but I couldn't. Then when I saw who was involved, a police detective, I didn't know who to trust." She met his eyes. "I'm still not sure." Palmer understood her hesitation. "What made you change your mind?" "The news that you were investigating. It made me hope that maybe there are still honest people in the system." She straightened her shoulders. "And because it was the right thing to do." "This changes everything," Palmer said, already reaching for his phone. "We'll need your formal statement. And this video will need to be authenticated, though it certainly looks genuine." "Will I need to testify?" Eliza asked, her voice steady despite the fear visible in her eyes. "If this goes to trial, yes. We'll do everything possible to protect you, but I won't lie. Testifying against a police officer is never easy." Eliza nodded. "I understand the risks." As Palmer made calls, setting the machinery of justice in motion, Eliza stayed out his office window at the lights of Riverview. Somewhere out there was Detective Hargrove, perhaps believing he'd gotten away with murder. And beyond the city limits, in the dark waters of Blackwater River, life continued its ancient cycles, indifferent to human concerns. She had entered the water that night as a scientist. She was emerging now as something else, a witness to both the worst and best of human nature. The worst, a trusted officer betraying his oath. The best, her own courage, surprising even herself. The footage she captured would change everything, not just for the case, but for her life as well. There would be no going back to comfortable anonymity. But when she thought of Walter Kensington's eyes in those final moments, she knew she'd made the right choice. Justice, like truth, sometimes needed to be dragged into the light, even if the hands that did the dragging ended up scared in the process. Detective James Hargrove sat alone in his kitchen, a glass of untouched whiskey on the table before him. The house was quiet, his wife asleep upstairs, unaware that their world was about to collapse. The evening news had reported that the Kensington case had been reopened as a homicide investigation, but so far his name hadn't been mentioned publicly. It was only a matter of time. His phone rang, a number he recognized but wished he didn't. He answered without speaking. "We have a problem," Mayor Frank Collins said, his voice tight with tension. "Internal Affairs has the security footage from Kensington's estate. They know your story about dropping him off is false." "I'm aware," Hargrove replied flatly. "Are you also aware that the DA's office just received video evidence from a witness? Someone who was under the bridge that night." Hargrove's blood ran cold. What? Some scientist doing research, had cameras in the water, caught everything apparently. The kitchen seemed to spin around him. Hargrove gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. "Everything. That's what I'm told. They're moving to arrest you tomorrow morning." The mayor paused. "I've never had this conversation with you. Do you understand?" "Yes." "Good luck, Jim." After hanging up, Hargrove sat motionless, staring at the family photos on his refrigerator. 20 years on the force, a respected detective, a loving husband, a doting grandfather, and now a murderer about to be exposed. It hadn't started with murder, just small favors at first, looking the other way on building code violations, losing paperwork for certain permits, then accepting thank you gifts that grew larger over time. When he realized how deep he'd gotten, it was too late to back out. The River Heights project was worth hundreds of millions, and too many powerful people were invested in its success. Make the old man see reason, they told him. Convince him to drop his investigation. But Walter Kensington couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be bought. So Hargrove had made a choice on that foggy bridge, a terrible choice that he'd have to live with or die with. He picked up his service weapon from the table, weighing it in his hand. At the district attorney's office, a team had been working through the night. Financial records were spread across the conference room table, bank statements, shell company registrations, offshore account details. District Attorney Robert Palmer studied the evidence board where photos of key players were connected by red string: Detective Hargrove, Mayor Collins, 3 city council members, developers, contractors. At the center was Walter Kensington's photo. "The financial trail is solid," said Assistant DA Nancy Webb, pointing to a flowchart. Kensington was right about everything. The River Heights project was inflated by at least $30 million, with kickbacks flowing through these shell companies to city officials and Detective Hargrove. "And our witness?" Palmer asked. "Dr. Chen's story checks out. Her university confirmed she had authorization for the research project. The equipment is registered to her department. The video has been authenticated by our tech team, no signs of tampering." Palmer nodded. "What about protection for her?" "We've arranged a safe house until the trial. She's there now, with 2 officers I personally vetted." "Could?" Palmer rubbed his tired eyes. "We move on Hargrove at dawn. Make sure the arrest team knows he's potentially dangerous and may be tipped off." As the meeting broke up, Palmer's phone rang, the officer guarding Eliza Chen's safe house. "Sir, we have a situation. A patrol car just drove past this location. Slowly. Twice." "Did they stop?" "No, sir. But it wasn't one of ours. And our location is supposed to be need to know only." Palmer's stomach tightened. "Stay alert. I'm sending backup." He hung up and turned to Nancy. "We may have a leak." At the Riverview Gazette, Paul Turner was putting the finishing touches on the biggest story of his career. His editor, Bill Hansen, read over his shoulder. "This will shake the city to its foundations," Hansen said. "You're sure about every detail? All your sources are solid?" Paul nodded. "Multiple sources confirming each major point, and I've seen the financial records myself." "But not this underwater video everyone's talking about." "No. The DA's office is keeping that under wraps until the arrest." Paul stretched his tired back. "But my source there confirms it clearly shows Hargrove pushing Kensington off the bridge." Hansen whistled low. The hero cop. The respected detective. All those commendations on his wall. "Just a front," Paul said, typing the final lines of his article. "The perfect cover for corruption. Who would suspect him?" "Walter Kensington did." Paul paused, thinking about the old millionaire he'd only met once. Yeah, and it cost him his life. As Paul saved his article for the morning edition, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Be careful." Hargrove not acting alone. Others involved. He showed the message to Hansen, whose face darkened. Lock the doors. Nobody comes in or out until morning. In her safe house across town, Eliza Chen couldn't sleep. The small bedroom was comfortable enough, and the two officers outside her door were professional and reassuring. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Walter Kensington's face as he struggled in the river. She got up and walked to the window, careful to stay back from the glass as instructed. The street below was quiet and dark, houses sleeping peacefully. These people had no idea of the corruption in their city or how close justice was to finally being served. A car turned onto the street, moving slowly, no headlights. Eliza's heart raced as she stepped back from the window. "Officer Davis," she called softly. The younger of her two guards appeared in the doorway. "Everything okay, Dr. Chen?" "There's a car outside. No lights." Davis moved carefully to peek through the blinds. His hand went immediately to his weapon. "Stay away from the windows. I'm going to check with my partner." As he stepped into the hallway, Eliza heard muffled sounds, a thud, a grunt, then silence. Fear froze her in place. Heavy footsteps approached her door. This wasn't Officer Davis coming back. Eliza looked around frantically for something, anything, she could use to defend herself. But she was a scientist, not a fighter. Her strength was knowledge, not force. Knowledge. She grabbed her phone and quickly opened her cloud storage account, fingers flying over the screen. The underwater video was still there, uploaded as a backup. She shared it to the district attorney, to Paul Turner at the Gazette, to her university department, to every email address she could think of. Just as she hit send on the last one, the bedroom door swung open. A man stood there, not Hargrove, but someone in a police uniform she didn't recognize. His eyes were cold as he raised his weapon. "You should have stayed underwater with your fish, Dr. Chen," he said flatly. The Riverview County Courthouse was packed beyond capacity on the first day of the trial. People stood shoulder to shoulder along the back wall. Reporters from national news networks crowded the press section. Everyone wanted to witness the case that had shocked the quiet Riverside community and exposed corruption at the highest levels of local government. Detective James Hargrove sat at the defendant's table, his once proud posture now slumped. His police uniform had been replaced by a plain gray suit that seemed to hang off his frame. Next to him, his lawyer whispered something in his ear, but Hargrove barely seemed to hear. On the other side of the courtroom, District Attorney Robert Palmer organized his notes, occasionally glancing at the woman sitting in the first row behind him. Eliza Chen looked different now, her hair cut short, dark circles under her eyes, a small scar visible near her temple. The attack at the safe house 3 months ago had left its mark, but she had survived. So had her evidence. Judge Helen Rodriguez entered the courtroom, and the buzz of conversation immediately ceased. "The state of Illinois versus James Hargrove," the bailiff announced. "Charges: first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, racketeering, and accepting bribes while in public office." The judge addressed the jury. 12 ordinary citizens now tasked with an extraordinary responsibility. You will hear evidence in this case that may be disturbing. You will hear about corruption in places we should be able to trust. You will be asked to determine not only if the defendant committed murder, but if that murder was part of a larger conspiracy. Hargrove stared straight ahead, his face expressionless. As Palmer delivered his opening statement, he laid out the story that had captivated the public for months. How Walter Kensington, a wealthy developer with a strong moral compass, had discovered financial irregularities in the River Heights project. How he had collected evidence of bribes and kickbacks. How Detective Hargrove, compromised by his own greed, had been sent to silence him. And silence him he did, Palmer said, pointing directly at Hargrove. By throwing him off Blackwater Bridge on a foggy April night. What Detective Hargrove didn't know was that someone was watching from below. All eyes turned to Eliza as Palmer continued. Dr. Eliza Chen, a marine biologist conducting research beneath the bridge, captured the entire event on her underwater cameras. She tried to save Mr. Kensington but couldn't reach him in time. Her courage in coming forward nearly cost her her life when corrupt officers tried to silence her too. But the truth could not be buried. When it was time for the defense to speak, Hargrove's lawyer argued that the video was inconclusive, that the financial records were circumstantial, that Hargrove had served the community faithfully for decades. But the evidence was overwhelming. Day after day, witnesses took the stand. Harold Green, Walter's attorney, testified about the envelope Walter had left with him in case of untimely death. Paul Turner from the Riverview Gazette described his meeting with Walter just before his death. Financial experts traced the money from inflated city contracts to offshore accounts, then back to key officials including Hargrove. Mayor Collins and 2 city council members had already pleaded guilty to lesser charges in exchange for their testimony against others in the conspiracy. When Eliza finally took the stand, the courtroom fell completely silent. She spoke clearly and precisely, as one would expect from a scientist. She described her research project, her position under the bridge that night, what she saw and heard, and her desperate attempt to save Walter. When Palmer played her underwater video footage, several jurors gasped audibly. The video showed everything: Walter's struggle in the water, the clear image of his face, and most stunning of all, Detective Hargrove visible at the railing watching him drown. During cross-examination, the defense attorney tried to shake her testimony. "Isn't it true that you initially fled the scene without reporting what you witnessed?" "Yes," Eliza admitted. "I was afraid." "Afraid of what exactly?" "I had just watched a police officer murder someone. I didn't know who to trust." "So you admit you have a bias against police officers?" Eliza shook her head. "No, I have a bias against murderers. Most police officers serve honorably. Detective Hargrove betrayed that honor." On the final day of testimony, to everyone's surprise, Hargrove himself asked to take the stand. Against his lawyer's advice, he addressed the court. "I've listened to everyone talk about me for weeks now," he began, his voice hoarse. "About what I did. About who I betrayed. They're right." He looked up, meeting the gaze of the jurors one by one. "I killed Walter Kensington. I took bribes. I betrayed my badge." A murmur ran through the courtroom. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Hargrove continued. "What I did can't be forgiven. But there are others involved who haven't been caught yet. People with more power than me, more money. I was just their tool." For the next hour, Hargrove laid out details of the corruption that had infected Riverview like a disease. Names, dates, amounts. By the time he finished, even his own attorney looked stunned. The jury deliberated for just 3 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on all counts. 6 months later, Eliza Chen stood at the railing of Blackwater Bridge, looking down at the waters where she'd once conducted her research. The river continued its timeless journey, untroubled by human concerns. "Dr. Chen?" She turned to find Peter Kensington, Walter's son, walking toward her. They'd met during the trial but hadn't spoken much. "Thank you for meeting me here," he said, joining her at the railing. "It's a difficult place for both of us," she replied. Peter nodded. "My father loved this town, even with its flaws. He must have been a remarkable man." "He was." Peter gazed out over the water. "That's why I wanted to talk to you. The Kensington estate has established a new foundation, the Walter Kensington Transparency Foundation. We'll fund investigative journalism, civic oversight programs, and scientific research that serves the public good." He turned to her. "We'd like you to lead the Scientific Grants Committee." Eliza was momentarily speechless. "I don't know what to say." "Said yes," Peter smiled. "Your research was important, and your courage even more so. My father would have approved." As they walked off the bridge together, a crew was installing a new plaque nearby. It read, "Dedicated to Walter Kensington, who believed that truth, like water, will always find its way to the light." Back in the city, the River Heights project was being rebuilt, this time with proper oversight and transparent budgeting. Detective Hargrove was serving his sentence, his testimony having led to dozens more arrests and ongoing investigations. The system wasn't perfect. Justice wasn't complete. But a hidden witness had changed everything, proving that even the powerful could be held accountable. And beneath Blackwater Bridge, the waters continued to flow, carrying away the old and bringing in the new, as they always had and always would.